All right, today we're going to be talking about a doctrine that I was in for a few years that teaches just some complete doctrine from hell. And the teachers are complete spiritual fornicators for teaching this, okay? And I've talked to some of these guys on the phone and they will not listen to you, some of them. Some of them will. But one of the main things that these whores teach is that the coming of the Lord and the gathering together in Matthew 24 is a completely different coming of the Lord and gathering together spoken about by the Apostle Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Now, the reason that these whores teach this spiritual fornicating doctrine is because if you teach the truth, in which they are the same event, then you have to say that the rapture happens after the tribulation. Why? Because in Matthew chapter 24 it says, after the tribulation of those days, then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great glory. And then he sends his angels to the four winds of heaven to gather his elect. So if you teach it correctly, then you have to teach that the rapture is post-tribulation. Because that's what Matthew 24 says. So in order to teach a pre-tribulation rapture, right, you have to say that what Paul's talking about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is a completely different coming of the Lord and gathering together. And this is not even what it says. 2 Thessalonians doesn't even say that. It doesn't even allude to that. So you have to be a whore to teach this stuff. Which I was for a few years, but I'm not no more. Look, I'm a recovering whore, all right? That's the story of a Christian, right? You got to recover from this stuff. Let's take a look at what it says. Now I beseech you, brethren, okay? By the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, and by our gathering together unto him. Paul's talking about the coming of the Lord and the gathering together. Is it the same as Matthew 24? Well, let's see if Paul even says that it's any different from Matthew 24. All right. That ye be not soon shaken in mind, or be troubled neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter, as from us, as that the day of Christ is at hand. Now let's stop for a second. They were worried. To put it in the easiest way, they were very worried, shaken up. Now he says, don't be like that, as that day of Christ is at hand. So what can this mean? Well, let's take this thought. Because they try to say, oh, well, the day of Christ is not the day of the Lord, even though Christ is the Lord. But let's see what they say matches. So if the day of Christ was the rapture, then, and it was the next thing to come for them, then why are they scared? Why are they worried if the rapture is next? Don't worry, the day of Christ is at hand. Let's see if Paul says that in the next verse. The very next verse is what Paul says. Let's see if that makes sense. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. Hold on a second. Which day, Paul, is not going to come until the falling away and the man of sin is revealed, and he sets himself up in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God and proclaiming to be all that is. What day is that? That's the day of Christ that it was just talking about. Oh, so wait a second. When does the day of the Lord then come that's all prophesied throughout the Bible? After these things happen, after the man of sin sets himself up in the temple of God in Israel, proclaiming to be God. Oh, so the day of Christ happens at the exact same time as the day of the Lord is supposed to happen. Oh, wait. Maybe the day of Christ is the day of the Lord. See that? For that day shall not come. What day? The day of Christ he just mentioned in the verse before that they were all worried about. He said, don't worry. That day's not going to come, except there come a falling away first, and the man of sin is revealed, who sets himself up in the temple of God, proclaiming himself that he is God. So he's telling them, Don't worry, because here's the markers. Why? Why? Because they were worried about the day of Christ. They didn't want to be in the day of Christ. Why? Because the day of Christ is the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is the wrath of God. See that? So, even if you said, oh, well, Paul's talking about something else, it still doesn't even say that. It still says, for this day of Christ to come, the Antichrist has to be sitting in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So mid-acts dispensationalism, either way you cut it, whether you want to say that the day of Christ is not the day of the Lord, or this is a separate coming and gathering, either way it doesn't work. Either way it doesn't work. Because it doesn't matter which way you cut it, it doesn't work. And it doesn't matter anyways, because it's the same coming of the Lord and gathering together that Matthew chapter 24 is talking about. Same one. Same one. But it takes spiritual harlotry. It takes fornication, spiritual fornication. It takes teachers that are whorish in their spirits to make something like this up. So blasphemous. So anti-Christ to teach this. It's a total false doctrine. Are there some things that they teach as true? Sure. That's how the devil does it. Tells you all kinds of truth. Why? Because he's planning on slipping on a big old lie. Look at John MacArthur. He teaches a lot of good things, but all of a sudden you can take the mark of the beast and still be saved. That's how the devil does it. And that's what mid-acts dispensationalism does. Get out. Take the meat, chew the meat, and spit out the bones and get out of it. Because that is a lie. The rapture happens after the tribulation. After the tribulation of those days, then shall they see the coming of the Son of Man in all his great glory. And he shall send his angels of the four winds of heaven to gather his elect. Same thing that Paul's talking about. And when does that happen in Matthew 24? Same time as 2 Thessalonians. After the Antichrist is in the temple and proclaiming himself to be God. Paul's talking about the exact same thing. And you got this denomination out there. Totally lying to the people. And when you tell them about it, they hang up on you. Or they try to hang up on you, or they try to shut you up. Because they're harlots and they're whores. Get out.